Brock University acknowledges the land which we gather is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom need to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada treaties and is within by the Twin Wampum Agreement. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and acknowledging reminds us that our great standard of living is directly related to the resources and friendship of Indigenous people. Good morning, and welcome to this session of Business Breeders, a live webinar series hosted by Goodman Group at Brock University. My name is Abdul Brahimi, and it's my distinct pleasure to serve as the director of Goodman Group at Brock University. Goodman Group is a community-focused learning and development services provider that works to support professionals, businesses, and entrepreneurs pursuing growth, education, consulting services, and startup support. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome the many of you who have joined us today, taking your break and breather with us. This webinar series aims to provide 45-minute breathers filled with insightful discussions on timely topics that are relevant to businesses and everyday lives, led by award-winning Brock University faculty and leading industry experts, encouraging thoughtful debates, keeping us all feeling connected all together. This webinar series is hosted on Wednesdays from 11 to 11:45. In a moment, I'll hand the screen over to today's webinar lead, that's Dr. Robyn Bourgeois, who will lead today's discussion. Robyn will speak for approximately 30 minutes, and then we'll spend some time answering your questions. You may pose your questions live using the chat feature, which is open now, or you may also pose your questions via Twitter, and you may tweet them at GSB Goodman Group. That's at GSB Goodman Group, all one word, and have those come through live. Now, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce today's webinar lead. Dr. Robyn Bourgeois is a mixed-race Nahiye-1 Cree woman whose Cree family comes from Treaty 8 territory, Lesser Slave Lake, but was born and raised in Salix and splits in territories in the southern interior of British Columbia. She is connected through her 3 children to the 6 nations of the Grand River. Dr. Bourgeois is an associate professor in the Center for Women's and Gender Studies at Brock University and is currently serving as Brock's acting Vice-Provost, Indigenous Engagement. As a survivor of multiple forms of violence, including sexual exploitation and human trafficking, Dr. Bourgeois' work focuses on violence against Indigenous women and girls in Canada, and particularly Indigenous women's anti-violence leadership. Robyn has also spent the last 20 years involved in activism and community organizing around violence against Indigenous women and girls and gender-based violence generally. Welcome, Robyn.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to flip over now to share my screen because
Over to you. Thank you for being here, Robyn. Welcome to today's session.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to just flip over so you can see my screen, so I can share with you my slides for today. Here we go. So I'm going to flip through these first ones because you've got a little bit of knowledge about what we're here for today, and I'm going to start here. Welcome, as we say in Cree, Tanzi Kinanas Kamatanao. That means hello and thank you. And it's more than thank you, it's I'm grateful for you. That's the most accurate translation of that term, is that I am grateful for you. So I'm grateful for all of you for being here today. No, I don't think, I think nowadays it's not surprising anymore for people to understand that in Canada, we have a problem with violence against Indigenous women and girls. You've all heard the statistics. Indigenous women, right now are currently about 5.5 times more likely to be murdered than non-Indigenous women. Our rates of disappearances are very similar. They're disproportionate. We're 4% of the population, and yet we're almost 20% of homicide cases in Canada. And I think many of you are aware that in the last few years, the Government of Canada has undertaken a national inquiry into the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Now, when I think about this event and I think about the future, I get this thought in my head that that inquiry, that national inquiry, which released its final report actually almost 2 years ago, June 3rd, 2019, I think when we look back on that, I think Canadian history is going to claim that inquiry as a success belonging to Prime Minister Trudeau and his government, who after 10 years of resistance from Stephen Harper and his Conservative government made the decision to go ahead with a national inquiry. Now, I want to stop everybody right there before we even get to that kind of dialogue, because really, that victory, the victory of the national inquiry, belongs to Indigenous women and girls who for the last 40 years have spent a lot of time, largely unpaid, working at the grassroots, the provincial, territorial, the national, the international levels, demanding justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Those are the women whose victory this belongs to. And that's my entry point into this talk today, because we often talk about violence against Indigenous women, and I know I'm guilty of this myself, just focusing on the violence itself. And yet the picture that most people don't see is the fact that, in fact, Indigenous women have been the leaders. They've been at the forefront of this battle against this violence, and that they have given everything to fight for this justice. And to me, it's actually very emblematic of the kind of leadership that Indigenous women experience. And so that's what I want to share with you today. I want to offer you a perspective on Indigenous women and leadership. I really want to paint the picture today that Indigenous women are formidable leaders. In fact, it is really mandated historically, traditionally, through our laws and our cultural practices. I want to explain where Indigenous women leaders come from in their work, and I really want to give you a sense of how really strong Indigenous women are as leaders. And I really hope that I can help people understand that, you know, we're not helpless victims waiting to be saved. In fact, we are fierce warrior women who are fighting for the betterment of our families, but also all people every single day. And I hope that maybe this will help folks who aren't familiar with Indigenous women in leadership have a better understanding of where we're coming from when we do the kinds of things that we do. So before I can get into kind of that dialogue, I think it's really important to situate myself in this discussion to give you a sense of why I speak about Indigenous women in leadership. So my story starts actually in a very grim way. I am a survivor of sexual exploitation and human trafficking. I was sexually exploited in my late teens in Vancouver. And for those of you who might know the history, this is 96, 97. That is exactly at the height of the Picton killings in Vancouver and the case of Vancouver's missing women. And so I was very fortunate. I had two friends who were murdered by Picton, and I was very fortunate to survive. I really saw that as a second chance in life for me, and I decided I was not ever going to waste that second chance. I was going to fight to change the world, not just so for Indigenous women and girls, but so that no other person in this world ever had to deal with the kind of violence that I was experiencing. And so I started actually before I got into academia. This was during my undergrad when I still was like, what am I going to do? But I knew school was a way of empowerment for me. I got involved in activism around missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And so I ended up being involved in a lot of community work, first in BC, but then I moved. I've had the good fortune to live across Canada. So I've also been part of organizing here in the Greater Toronto area and the Niagara region. And then I've lived all the way across the country in Mi'kma'ki, which you probably know as Nova Scotia, and I've worked in communities there. These are actually some of these pictures here. The one in black and white is me speaking at the very first No More Silence rally in downtown Toronto many, many years ago. The second is another rally around the same time, 2008, 2009, because I'm also a hand drummer and singer, and we were always organizing events in Toronto. And so that's a picture that I just actually found again, which I love. So I ended up doing that community work a lot in terms of my leadership. And then I went into academia, and for my PhD, ended up doing my graduate research on Indigenous women's leadership, in particular with involvement in state-sponsored anti-violence responses, so inquiries, commissions, but I also looked at the work of NWAC through Sisters in Spirit. I also looked at a bunch of things, but I was really interested in Indigenous women's leadership in relation to those kind of Canadian state-sponsored anti-violence responses. And I found some, really fascinating things. One is that Indigenous women are incredibly politically savvy, and despite the fact that these processes often try to recolonize their efforts, Indigenous women came up with some brilliant strategies to kind of circumvent or undermine these attempts to eliminate their efforts. So, but also the other part of that picture was that these processes often try to recolonize Indigenous women and their leadership in support of Canada and colonialism. And so that's the two sides of this story here. And it's one of the reasons why, if you go back, I think this is about 2014, that I wrote a blog for the Huffington Post when it was all up in debate whether the inquiry should happen or not. I spoke out against it because I was very much opposed. My concern was always that the government of Canada would do this inquiry and the report would sit on the shelf and nothing would happen. And honestly, 2 years in, that's pretty much what's happened. But that's led to more leadership on my part, because the picture you see on the right, there's a backstory to that. After calling out the inquiry, I ended up getting called to testify as an expert and experiential witness on sexual exploitation, human trafficking, and sexual violence. So I ended up actually participating in the inquiry and getting an inside look at what that was like. And then in response to that concern I had, I started a group at Brock that some of you may be familiar with, but it's called the Decolonial Reading Circle. And for the last 2 years, I've been walking groups of people from Brock through the final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, with the goal of creating an action plan in response to the 231 calls for justice that were issued by the inquiry. So that's a little bit about why I speak about this. It's because I come from this background of both community-based, activist, and academic leadership. So I'm not just speaking about this as an academic who sat on the sidelines and studied this. I've been very much a part of this for the last 20 plus years. So I could give you an overview of Indigeneity and say, well, this is generally how Indigenous women are in terms of leadership, but that is a kind of a fatal colonial sin that we refer to as pan-Indigeneity, because there's this belief, there's a tendency to paint all Indigenous, and as we're talking Indigenous, of course, I just want to remind people I'm talking First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We always tend to sometimes put them in a group and paint them all the same. And that's a little problematic because we are distinct nations with distinct teachings, distinct ways of knowing and doing and being. And so it's really important that whenever we talk about Indigeneity, especially as an Indigenous person, that we ground our work in our own ways of knowing and doing. And so I am Cree. As you heard in my introduction, my family is Cree from Northern Alberta, Treaty 8 territory, which is in this Lesser Slave Lake region. And in fact, my family has connections to multiple communities in that territory. And so the teachings I'm going to give you today are grounded in Cree, and we say Cree in Nahiawa, ways of knowing and doing. And I will ask your forgiveness and maybe a little bit of patience with me. I am still learning my language. I was not fortunate enough to grow up having my language. So I will try my best with my pronunciations, but please just be kind to me at this point. I'm still learning. So where we have to start is when we think about Indigenous women in leadership in a Cree perspective, it comes down to this incredible group of warrior women. And that's the Cree word that is across the top of the stage. Oki Sita Wisquiwak. And that means quite literally warrior women. Of course, now it's sometimes translated into clan mothers, although as Cree people, we don't have clans. So you may have encountered that if you've worked with the Haudenosaunee. They have their nations, and then within their nations, they have clans. Cree people don't have clan mothers, but this was pretty much the closest group of women we had. These were women who were born into these roles most often, but also sometimes if women displayed incredible strength and courage or incredible knowledge of our ways of knowing and doing, then they might be elevated to this status. Now, to understand the important role, their leadership role in our community, you really need to know just a little bit about how Cree people understand the world. And that is where we have to start with our natural law, which is Manito, we yin I ki wina. I'm working on this, but natural law. So as Cree people, we live under what we call natural law. Natural law are laws that were handed to us from Creator, and they pertain to multiple aspects. There's laws that just pertain to people. There are laws to everything in creation. There's laws that apply to the spirit world. And then there's these really sacred laws that are just the holiest of our laws that really, they shouldn't be recorded, and you only get to ever hear them if you happen to be a Cree person. So I'm not going to talk about those today. But the idea of natural law really is rooted in this idea of, it's the second word down from there, Wakotawin. We live in a belief that all things in creation are equal, that we are rooted, and you've heard that if you've ever been around Indigenous people and they say, all my relations, in Cree we say, kaki ya ni wakamakanak. That basically means that's honoring that. So we believe that all things in creation, whether it's people, animals, the water, the land, the air, it has life, which we call Pimatsuin. And what happens, why we believe that is because our creation story talks about that the way people and rocks and water are created is that there's a spark of a flame taken from what we call the soul fire. And that spark is put on the back of your head. In fact, that's why we believe that babies have soft spots when they're born, is because that's where their flame goes. And so if everything in creation has that flame, then everything in the world is related, which also means that everything in creation has value. And so that's what the natural laws help us do, is to live in harmony with all things in relation. And that's the goal. The goal is always about harmony and balance. And in fact, we live with this idea of what we call Mino Pimatsuin, which is living a good life, which means in a good way, in accordance with our natural laws. And so we strive to not only live that for ourselves and the best, it's really about living a good life in a good way with respect and dignity and truth and humility. But we also want to preserve all of that for future generations and ensure that all of our future generations can live Mino Pimatsuin. So that's where our warrior women come in. The warrior women, unlike many of our Western capitalist systems, the women of our communities, these women are the keepers of our law. So they actually not only interpret natural law, but they also implement justice, take action on a case-by-case basis. They are the people, they are the law and the order. And I hate to say order, because our understanding of justice is very different from Western systems. We are away from more punitive. I mean, unless there's something serious, I will say if violence against Indigenous women happens, it's punitive. It's really punitive, actually, in a way that might surprise folks. But in general, we are about supporting people and maintaining the balance and trying to undo the harm in a really good way. So our women are the keepers of our law, which also makes them the source of education in Cree communities. So women are entrusted with sharing the knowledge of natural law, and particularly women's teachings to future generations, because there is, within Cree, there are specific teachings that are for women and anyone who identified as a woman, and for men and anyone who identifies as male. And so they are really responsible, though, for the women's teachings, plus the main teachings around natural law are the responsibility of women. The other important part about warrior women is that they are responsible for carrying children into the nation. And that doesn't just mean giving birth. I mean, that certainly is one of the reasons that Cree women are so respected, is for the ability to bring life into the world. But we also have ceremonies that introduce the baby, and it's actually these women, the warrior women, who are the first to actually meet the child and then introduce them to the community. And it's a really beautiful ceremonial process, but they are the ones to introduce that child to the rest of the nation. That's their critical and important role in terms of leadership. The other thing that's really important is that our warrior women are our ceremonial leaders. So when it comes to sacred practices, when it comes to songs, when it comes to doing the things we need to do to honor creation, they are our leaders in these things. And that actually comes from the learnings from our basic trickster. We have a basic trickster in our stories called Wisagichuk, and Wisagichuk visits a certain chief and says, the women need to be responsible for this. They need to be the people who are leading the community. And that historically has been how Cree people run. In fact, we are very matriarchal and matrilineal in the way of our thinking. Your lineage is traced through women. All of the things about, like, if we don't have property ownership, but the use of land is dictated by women, so is the redistribution of wealth and access to resources. Women are basically the leaders of the community. Now, when I say that, I want to be really clear about something. When we talk about matriarchy, quite often people imagine really the reverse of patriarchy, where women sit atop and basically rule men. That's not how Cree people understand the world. What we do understand is that all things in creation have life and value. And while there are differential roles between, perhaps, at the simplest level, men and women, because in Cree we actually have at least six different gender identities. But the belief is that we are all needed and we need to live in harmony and peace with one another. And it's not about power and control. It's really about making sure that we live in a good way, that everybody benefits from the natural world and our relationship with it. So that is a basic overview of our warrior women. Now, one of the things that's really important in relation to these teachings, though, is that we are raised understanding that we have an ethical responsibility to lead, and we have a duty to act at all times. And this has been an interesting in working in other Indigenous communities, because not every community has this same kind of law about this. And so sometimes I bump heads with groups because they are more peaceful and want to be respectful and come together in a good way. And I'm like, yeah, but as a Cree woman, I'm taught I have to take a stand. I have to be responsible for my community, and I have to act when something happens. And this is actually within our natural law. And so I've given you, these are two, we have multiple or various different kinds of breaches of natural law, but these are the two I really want to talk about. And I'm going to bring a third one in too that I forgot to put on the slide, but we have crimes where you use language against people. So Pastamoan is just using language against other people. And then the other Osinemoan is the use of language against creation. And what these things tell us is that one of the simplest way to interpret this is you can use language against people in speaking in a bad way and gossiping and saying harmful things to people, but you can also equally be held responsible if you don't say anything. And I want to read you this great quote. And if you have not read this book, one of the best books about Cree natural law is Sylvia McAdams' book, Nationhood Interrupted. It's a tiny little book, but it's so packed full of brilliant knowledge. But she has this great quote that talks and really captures the basics of what it means, what Pastamoan means when you're silent. So she writes, silence and non-action do not exempt any human being from breaking laws. It's considered Pastamoan, a verbal violation of natural law, to remain silent or take no action while harm is being done to another human being or to anything in creation. So the natural law says that our silence, really, in the words of Audre Lorde, our silence will not save us. And we have a duty and an ethical responsibility to say something. So if we see somebody being harmed, we have a responsibility to say something. If we see something that's going to harm, potentially carry harms for future generations, we have an ethical responsibility to do something. In fact, this is really important. Sometimes when you see Indigenous women leading something, like whether it's water walks or land defenders, you might think, we're being kind of selfish and just doing this for us, but that's not it at all. In fact, our teachings emphasize the importance of us taking action for all people. And I want to turn to another quote from Sylvia McAdam for this, because she really explains this. And this is the third one that I was going to say that's not on there. Narama Wasawin is a law carried by Nahia people in times of great threat and crisis. Narama Wasawin means to defend for all human children of the world as well as future generations. Also, Natama Wasawin directs us to defend for the children of all animals, plants, water, and the winged ones, everything in creation that has spirit. So as Cree women in particular, we are raised with this understanding that we have a responsibility to lead in our communities. We have a responsibility to act as well. And what I've shared with you here, the diagram, I'm sure you've all seen the medicine wheel. This one might look slightly different for you, because in the Cree medicine wheel, the one you commonly see has white, red, yellow, and black. Cree people don't use black, we use blue. And so the medicine wheel is a device that we use that shares different teachings. So I could have given you a more complex one that shows all of these spaces are sorted with different directions, different elements, different things, different ages, different all kinds of different teachings. It's a way for us to remember our teachings, because we're primarily oral cultures. So this is a mnemonic device to really help us. But I share this one, and this comes from a Cree elder of mine from my territory. And she has been developing this kind of idea of leadership in relation to the medicine wheel. And she showed us this basic slide. So she said along the lines, not within the quadrants themselves, but the lines themselves represent certain particular things, responsibilities. So one is that you focus on relationships, one is that you think, one is that you look at the tasks, and then the most important being that you act. We are always taught that everything must lead to action. So yes, you need to sit, you need to think. You'll often hear that from me as an Indigenous leader. You'll come to me and talk to me about something, and I'll be like, I need to sit with that. And it just means I need time to process it, because we're also taught that our words carry huge weight, and that once they're issued, they can cause havoc. So you have to be really careful about what you say. But we always, no matter what, have to lead to action. If we don't act, we are breaking natural law. And so it's really built into us as Cree women that we have this responsibility, and it's an ethical responsibility to lead, and it's an ethical responsibility to act. So that's why you'll often see Cree women at the front lines of things, because we take that to heart. That is what we're taught we're supposed to do. If we see injustice, we speak out. If we see something that needs done, we take the lead and we get to action. So that's a really good overview of the Cree way of leading. And I will say this, there are teachings that I've shared here that are really common to other Indigenous groups. So you may confront that when you're looking at other groups. But again, just to resist pan-Indigeneity, I wanted you to see it specifically from my Cree teachings and the way I understand the world. Now, the really horrible part, there's a spelling mistake there. I should have checked that. See, the academic me catches these things now. Colonialism has really assaulted Indigenous women and their ability to lead. And really, for those of you who are maybe confronting the term for the first time, or you've heard multiple definitions, colonialism really is, at the most basic level, the idea of land being stolen and being occupied, and the Indigenous peoples being dehumanized and controlled. And very strategically, colonialism in Canada has meant undermining Indigenous women's leadership. So, for example, early on, when we look at things like the fur trade even, and the first kind of movements of colonialism, what we would see is things like people coming to negotiate with the community, and the community, of course, would send its women leaders, and they would refuse to negotiate with the women because in a patriarchal colonial framework, that's not how it works. And so that was the beginning of the undermining of this. But it also comes into law. So in 1876 with the Indian Act, which is still in place to this day. So it's an act that belongs to the government of Canada. It is not a treaty, so please don't ever say that. It's actually a legislation that controls who can count as Indigenous, and who has status and who has rights to land, rights and obligations. And it's really, quite honestly, one of the most racist acts of legislation, because we are the only group in Canada whose race is defined for them. But one of the things that came in with that act is from 1876 to 1951, it imposed, well, not till 1951, it still does this, but beginning in 1876, it imposed democratic elections on Indigenous communities. But between 1876 and 1951, Indigenous women were outlawed not only from running from government, but from even being able to vote. So that's almost 100 years of being formally foreclosed out of any type of leadership in the community, or at least the most official kind that the government of Canada recognized. I don't want to paint the picture that that was the end of our matriarchal forms of leadership. That was not the case at all. In fact, they've struggled to survive. And there's a really great example in this territory, because you have the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, so the union of 5 and then 6 nations into a single collective confederacy, and they've had clan mothers, and that system of clan mothers is still in place to this day. So it just attempted to undermine that. There's a lot of gender or sex discrimination, depending on how you view it, in the Indian Act, which actually cut off the ability of Indigenous women to exercise any sorts of leadership. So that includes things like outlawing our ceremonies, outlawing our meetings, keeping us tied to certain particular places of land. It's just been a nonstop kind of assault. And even though that's changed in terms of formal governance in 1951, we still see a real lag in terms of Indigenous women's leadership in those kind of formal, government approved systems of governance. So, for example, if you go look at the Assembly of First Nations right now, which is all of the elected chiefs, you'll see that women still are grossly outnumbered by Indigenous men. And unfortunately, that means quite often that our Indigenous women's experience are often left to the side. But as I said, that doesn't mean that we aren't still fighting, that we aren't still warrior women, exercising leadership and trying to change the world for everyone. And I've given you a few examples here. As I said at the beginning, Indigenous women weren't helpless victims who sat around as we were murdered or disappeared. We were at the forefront of that. We were fighting every single day. I can tell you untold stories of sitting in community and having no money and doing whatever we could to try to raise awareness and demand justice for our women and girls. And we did it in our own ways. That's one of the really incredible things about that movement is, we took to the streets, but we were also drumming and singing. We did walks across the country, so we were connected to the land. We used ceremony in that leadership. So we really embedded it, our approach, while very political and making use of some of the political mechanisms like UNDRIP or governmental funding, that we actually also did our own thing. And it was really powerful. And I have so many memories of the kind of fierce, strong leadership of warrior women who've been involved in the fight for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit folks. I couldn't give this talk without mentioning Cindy Blackstock, who has worked her whole life to fight for our children and to fight not only for education for our children, but also the child welfare system. Because I'm sure many of you know that despite the fact that Indian residential schools are no longer operating, that now our kids are being apprehended through the child welfare system. And unfortunately, one of the consequences of that also is missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So Cindy Blackstock has been fighting, and she's had a very tough battle. I mean, she's been surveilled. She wins a lawsuit and then has to face another one. But her leadership has been critical for us. And we're very lucky, and hopefully very soon I'll be able to give you the formal introduction. But we were gifted one of her spirit bears at Brock, and we will be doing the work that accompanies that to raise awareness of issues impacting Indigenous children today. The other examples that really come to mind are the water walkers. So we have incredible people, and I think most of you might be familiar with Autumn Peltier, who is a very young woman who has had such an impact. But our women have walked for water because we understand that as our medicine. And so women have been at the forefront of leading to raise awareness and to demand protection of our water resources here in Canada. We also have land defenders, and I really want to touch on this because I think sometimes when you see things like Wet'suwet'en or land back, it's often, you look at it and you're like, what are they doing and why is this? And, they're just doing this to protect themselves. It's not the case at all. Land defenders are doing what they're doing because they want to protect the land, and not just for their generations, but also future generations. And that's really what that's about. It's about protecting the land and making sure that we are environmentally and ecologically responsible so that our children and that everyone's children has a safe place to live. And then final place, because I touched on the Indian Act, was that our women have been really integral in dismantling gender discrimination in the Act itself. Like huge battles, incredible things where, our women have walked across the country. They've gone to the United Nations and launched court cases. They've sued through the Canadian government system, and they worked really hard to finally get some amendments that really ended the kinds of gender discrimination in the Indian Act. So I've been talking a whole lot, and I want to stop there because I really am eager to have a conversation about some of the things I shared. So I'm just going to switch over and stop my, and now of course I'm never going to find the screen again, but I'm going to go on to chat.
Thank you, Robyn, very much. Very, very insightful in there in terms of what you're sharing. So a few questions. Let me start with this one, with this first one. So can you repeat the name of the book about the natural law?
Sure. And actually I can show you. So the book is called Nationhood Interrupted, and it's by Sylvia McAdam. And Sylvia McAdam, for those of you who might remember, is one of the co-founders of Idle No More. So she is herself a leader and an activist, and that book is incredible. It's one of the best discussions of natural law I've ever read in my whole life.
And we can also put a link to that in the slides that will be made available for those that are watching.
Absolutely.
The next question is, so you spoke about women experiencing a lot of violence, but what about men? Do Indigenous men experience violence, anything like what women do?
Great question. And the answer is yes and no. It's yes, because of course they do. In fact, I think the homicide rates for Indigenous men at this rate, or at this point, are they're 8 times more likely than non-Indigenous men to be murdered. So the rates are there. Why we draw the differentiation, though, is because there are gender dimensions to it. The kind of violence that Indigenous women experience is distinct from the kind of violence that Indigenous men experience. But we also, and I mean, this is part of the ethical responsibility, is we also do need to hold our men accountable, because our men are participating in some of this abuse against our women. And just, also I will say as well, acknowledging that women also participate in abuse against men, but by far and large, the bigger problem is the other way around. And so it is the same, and it's all part of the same process. It's just paying attention to the particular gendered nature of the violence, because there are very, for example, Indigenous women are most frequently sexually assaulted before they're murdered. That doesn't happen to our men, right? So we need to pay attention to those things. But yeah, same thing.
Right. Yeah. So this next one is, this is speaking around the geographies of urban versus non-urban. So with the attraction of the cities where you hear the most about these violence, so violent events, what is the attraction about the cities?
Well, you know what? It's an attraction. It's like, it's almost push-pull factors. It's both. One of the things that's really hard, and for those of you who have maybe never been on a reserve or lived on a reserve, it's not easy. If you think about something like Six Nations, which is our closest reserve, which is the largest population size in Canada, it's really kind of an urban reserve in some ways, because it's located right in, like, off the GTA. And yet there are people who don't have indoor plumbing. There are people who don't have water. There are people who are living in substandard housing that was funded by the government of Canada. So it can be really hard to live in our communities. So in some ways they're push factors, because you can only do so much in our communities. For example, you can't go to high school in most of our communities. Most of us have to leave our communities to go to high school. Even at Six Nations, they go into other communities to go to school. So we can't even go to school in our own community. If we want to go to post-secondary, we have to leave our communities. You have to go to, a major university. So there are these push factors. And, for a lot of us, it's violence too. I mean, it's really hard growing up in the community sometimes. Not that it's not, like, there are beautiful things about living in community, and there are wonderful things, but there are some pushes there. But then there are draws. I remember being a young person, and all I could think about was going to the big city, right? Because it just seemed like there was so many more opportunities, and, maybe that's where dreams can happen in some ways. And so I think there's a bit of both. And in fact, right now, actually, 80% of our population lives in urban centers. I mean, that's our lived reality now, and it really is a bunch of push-pull factors. It's, we want to be in our communities, but there's so limited opportunity sometimes in our communities that we have to go out. Then when we get out, there's risks there, right? Dislocation, disassociation, and yet there's also really strong community. In most urban settings, I mean, I think of the Niagara region, we have a fierce little group of Indigenous folks who've come together, mostly through the friendship centers, but we have a community here, right? So it's both. Yeah.
Very good. Be interesting in terms of the stats you said about 80 or so % live in the cities. How does that compare to non-Indigenous communities?
Yes.
There are certain attractions, as you pointed, at certain age, younger, you might be more attracted to larger cities with a little bit more, a few more amenities, and then anyway. So, interesting insights. Okay, on this next one is, with all the great work that you're doing to support Indigenous women, what are some of your hopes and goals for Indigenous women in Canada?
Great question. Given my focus, I will say at the most basic level, I just want the ability for me and for others, and not just Indigenous women and girls, because what I want to say is that in tackling this violence, we tackle it for everyone. And so my goal is that we can all live lives free from violence, where we don't have to live in fear every day, where I don't have to make careful decisions about my children because I'm scared of what they could face when they walk in the world, where I don't have to every day share missing person reports on my social media. I want a day where we can all live without that fear of violence. And that's my dream. That really is what I'm striving for every single day. I really want to get to a point where we have a really strong recognition of how strong Indigenous women are, that we aren't just the victims in these stories, that we are fierce, that we are fighting every single day, and that we do it in our own unique and beautiful ways that change the world. I think in ways that benefit everyone. I'm kind of thinking, you know, I wish more people would spend time learning about our ways of knowing and doing, because I really do think it could change the world. And I think actually that if more people, if we had those conversations, we'd see we have more in common than we do not. And so my goal is hopefully to unite us all so we can start fighting for collective good together. So my picture is broad because it's not just about Indigenous women and girls. That's certainly my focus, but I believe I want to change the world. I don't understand the point of being here unless I may change the world, right? It's funny, I had a therapist once say to me, you know, you're not responsible for that. And I was like, what are you talking about? That's my job. I'm going to change the world. So that's my goal.
Fantastic, right? You know, great. Fantastic, brilliant. It's good to have individuals like you thinking about that broader picture, you know, and change. It could be one step at a time, one person at a time, but
exactly,
over time, it will get there.
We're in this together. Let's walk the journey. Let's bring ourselves together and realize, you know, we're stronger together as community than we are if we fight against each other.
That's right.
Yeah.
Excellent words. Robyn, thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule and for sharing your thoughts and insights.
Thank you.
Much appreciated. As you're sharing your screen back again, I'll have some messages here. So Goodman Group is a community-focused learning and development services provider that works to support professionals, businesses, and entrepreneurs pursuing growth through professional development certificate programs, executive education, consulting services, and startup support. Goodman Group's upcoming professional development program, The Power of Teamwork, is a one-week program taking place over lunch breaks starting June 7th. This program helps current and aspiring managers learn about strategies to overcome challenges of managing in-person, hybrid, and virtual teams. For more information about funding opportunities and how to register, feel free to contact the team here at Goodman Group at any time and using the information that's on your screen. Well, that is all that we have time here for today's session of Business Breeders. Thank you all so much for tuning in for today's session. Joining me next week on the in 2 weeks' time on the next session of Business Breeders is Lida Madharavo, who will be talking about EDI and what does it all mean. I hope many of you can join us next time. Until then, stay safe.